There is a five-sided mountain on the surface of Mars that is nearly 2 miles long and rises almost a kilometer into the thin Martian sky. It sits in a region called Cydonia, a few miles from a hill that stares straight up into space with the shape of a human face. And in 1976, the first spacecraft ever to orbit and photograph that ground sent the picture back to Earth. And the scientists in the room went silent. Because the object in the frame was not round. It was not a crater. It was not a ridge worn down by wind. It had straight edges. It had a point at the top. It had 5 clean sides radiating out from a central peak like the spokes of a wheel, and every one of those sides met the next at an angle. The official answer is that it is a pile of eroded rock. But the deeper you look at the numbers that came out of that pile of rock, the harder that answer becomes to hold. Today, we are going to go through exactly what was found in Cydonia, who measured it, and why the explanation the public was handed does not close the case. Stay with me, because the part everyone laughs at is not the part that should unsettle you. Most people have heard of the face on Mars. They saw it on a magazine cover, or in a late-night show, or in a movie, and they filed it away with sea monsters and haunted houses. And then they stopped looking. Most people walk right past the real mystery without ever knowing it is there. Because the strangest object in Cydonia is not the face. The face is just the doorway. A few miles to the south of it sits something far harder to explain, and almost nobody talks about it because it does not have a friendly human shape you can point at. It has geometry, and geometry is worse. Here is the ground we are standing on. On July the 25th, 1976, an American spacecraft called Viking 1 was circling Mars, hunting for a safe place to land its sister craft on the surface. It was not looking for monuments. It was photographing thousands of square miles of terrain, one frame at a time, so engineers back on Earth could pick a landing site. And on that day, in a frame later labeled 35A72, it captured a mesa in the Cydonia region that looked, under the low afternoon sun, exactly like a human head gazing upward. The formation was roughly 2 kilometers across. A NASA press release a few days later described it as a huge rock formation that resembled a human head, formed by shadows giving the illusion of eyes, nose, and mouth. The scientists called it a trick of light, and it might have ended there as a one-day headline, if not for what happened next. 2 computer engineers at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, Vincent DiPietro and Gregory Molinar, went digging through the archive, and they found something the first announcement had missed. There was a second image of the same formation framed 70A13, taken 35 orbits later, under a completely different sun angle. If the face were only a trick of shadow, a different light should have erased it. It did not. The features were still there, the same shape held up under a different sun. That was the detail that turned a throwaway photo into a decades-long investigation. Because a shadow moves when the light moves. A structure does not. There is something else worth knowing about how the face was first received, because it tells you this was never only a tabloid story. When the image first came up on the screens at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, it stopped a room full of trained scientists cold. And the astronomer Carl Sagan, one of the most respected voices in planetary science, and a man not given to wishful thinking, later remarked that the pyramids of the region were worth a careful look. He called them beckoning. That is not a fringe endorsement, and Sagan himself ultimately favored the natural explanation. But the point stands. The objects were strange enough that serious people did not simply dismiss them at a glance. They looked twice, and looking twice is exactly what started the trouble. And while DiPietro and Molinar were studying those images, they noticed something else in the same neighborhood. Not far from the face, there were mountains with angular peaks, sharp corners, faces that met at edges. They started calling them pyramids, and one of them was so regular, so clean, that it would become the single most argued over rock in the solar system. That object is the reason this video exists. It sits about 20 kilometers from the face. It is a multi-sided mountain with a straight base, symmetrical flanks, and a defined apex at the top. 5 ridges run down from that central peak to 5 corners at the ground, and the whole thing has a shape that people have compared to a starfish, or to the 5-pointed geometry of a certain famous government building. It was named the D&M Pyramid, after Di Pietro and Molinar, the 2 men who first flagged it. And here is where the simple story of light and shadow starts to run out of room. Because a shadow can fake a face, a shadow cannot fake 5-fold symmetry across a kilometer of solid rock. What the D&M Pyramid demands is not a better sun angle, it demands an explanation for its shape. And that explanation is the thread we are going to pull for the rest of this video. Whatever built that shape, if anything built it at all, is the question that has never been answered. Hold on to it, because it does not get resolved. It only gets stranger. Before we go further, understand what Cydonia actually is, because the setting matters. It is a transition zone on Mars, a border region between the old cratered highlands in the south and the smooth low plains in the north. It is filled with mesas and knobs and flat-topped hills, the kind of landscape geologists compare to Monument Valley in the American Southwest. That comparison is the mainstream position, and it is not a foolish one. Mars has wind. Mars has had water. Erosion is real, and it can carve strange things. But here is the anomaly buried inside that tidy explanation. Monument Valley does not contain a symmetrical 5-sided pyramid whose central axis points directly at a 2-kilometer sculpture of a face. Erosion makes mesas. It does not, as a rule, make mesas that aim at each other. And that is exactly what people started to find when they stopped looking at single objects and started measuring the distances between them. This is the second thing that should make you uncomfortable. And it is the reason the story did not die in the 1970s. In 1983, a researcher named Richard Hoagland organized what he called the Independent Mars Investigation, pulling together people with backgrounds in image processing, geology, and cartography to study the Cydonia photographs in detail. They were not content to say a hill looked like a face. They wanted to know where everything sat, how far apart the objects were, and what angles connected them. And to do that properly, they needed someone who could turn a photograph into a map. They found him. And what he measured is clue number 1. His name was Erol Torun. He was not a fringe personality. He was a geomorphologist and cartographer who worked for the United States Defense Mapping Agency, the government body responsible for making precise maps for the military. His entire profession was measuring the shape of the ground accurately. In 1988, he took the images of the 500 and 1000 pyramid and did what a map maker does. He corrected the distortion, laid down a proper coordinate grid, and measured the object's internal angles as carefully as the data allowed. He came to the investigation as a skeptic. He expected to find a natural landform. He did not. To do the work properly, Torun did something no one had done with the Cydonia images before. He orthographically rectified them. In plain language, he removed the distortion that comes from a camera looking at the ground from an angle, and installed a precise grid of coordinates aligned true north to south, turning a photograph into an exact map. Only then could anyone calculate real angles, real distances, and real relationships between the objects, rather than eyeballing a picture. That single step, boring as it sounds, is what separated this from staring at clouds. It gave the investigation numbers instead of impressions. And the numbers were odd. Torun concluded that the internal angles and the symmetry of the 500 and 1000 pyramid were unlikely to occur in a natural mountain, and that he could not identify a known erosional process, wind, water, landslides, that would produce a formation that regular. Another investigator, an image processing specialist named Mark Carlotto, worked the same photographs through techniques used to analyze aerial reconnaissance, and reported that the objects held their apparent structure across different lighting and viewing conditions, rather than melting away as pure shadow play should. That was the professional opinion of a government cartographer, backed by an imaging engineer. But it was the next part that pushed the whole thing into territory nobody could easily wave away. When Torun looked at the ratios between those internal angles, he reported that the geometry appeared to encode mathematical constants. Not one, several. The numbers pi and e, two of the most fundamental constants in all of mathematics, showing up again and again in the relationships between the angles, expressed through ratios and trigonometric functions, to three significant figures. A pile of windblown rubble is not supposed to know what pi is. The mainstream reading of this is simple, and it deserves to be stated plainly. If you measure enough angles on any irregular object, you will eventually find some combination that lands near a famous number by pure chance. Take a mountain, draw enough lines, run enough ratios, and mathematics guarantees you will get lucky. That is a real objection, and we will come back to it hard later, because it is the strongest card the skeptics hold. But notice what Torun's defenders pointed out in return. He did not just find one number once. He reported the same constants appearing redundantly through different measurements in the same object. And then Hoagland took Torun's decoded pyramid and checked where it actually sat on the planet. According to his analysis, the pyramid was positioned at a Martian latitude whose tangent matched the ratio of e divided by pi. The number was not only inside the shape, it was in the shape's address on the planet. Whether that is a genuine signal or the most seductive coincidence ever measured is the argument. But the measurements themselves came from a defense mapping agency cartographer, not a tabloid. If a five-sided mountain that seems to know two mathematical constants unsettles you the way it unsettles me, subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next clue is the one that turned a single strange rock into something that looked like a plan. Because Torun and Hoagland did not stop at the pyramid. They kept measuring, and they found that the objects in Cydonia did not appear to be scattered at random. There was the face. There was the 500 and 1,000 pyramid to the south. And between and around them was a cluster of smaller mountains that the investigators started calling the city. A group of polyhedral hills with a rough, rectangular arrangement. And when they drew the lines, the alignments started to stack up. The main axis of the 500 and 1,000 pyramid pointed at the face. One edge of the pyramid pointed toward the center of the city. Another edge pointed at a strange isolated dome they nicknamed the Tholus. In the middle of the city sat a square of 4 hills they called the city square, and it marked the midpoint of the city's long axis, positioned like a vantage point from which a viewer would look directly out at the face. And there was a detail about the pyramid itself that fed the fire. Along its eastern flank, the structure appeared damaged, as if a section had collapsed inward. Just to the east of it sat a hole in the ground, whose bottom could not be seen. Unusual for a normal crater, deep enough that some investigators speculated it hinted at a hollow interior, as though material had slid into an empty space beneath. That is speculation, and it should be labeled as such, but it is the kind of feature that a solid, wind-carved mound is not supposed to have, and it kept the question alive. That is the second clue, and it is a different kind of evidence than the first. A single symmetrical object can be a fluke of erosion, but a symmetrical object that aims at a second object, which sits at a measured midpoint that looks toward a third object, is not describing a rock anymore. It is describing a layout. And the geometry ran deeper than a few sightlines. The investigators reported that certain angles kept surfacing across the whole complex, in particular, a value close to 19.5 degrees, tied to the geometry of a tetrahedron placed inside a sphere. The same angle turned up in the pyramid, in the relationships between objects, in the layout as a whole. Hoagland called this redundancy. and it was the heart of his case. A single coincidence is noise. The same specific number appearing again and again in the shape of an object and in the way that object relates to its neighbors starts to look less like noise and more like a signature. That is the claim, at least. Whether the redundancy is real design or the natural result of measuring a lumpy landscape with a favorite number in mind is precisely where the fight is. But the investigators were emphatic on one point. They were not describing a single lucky rock. They were describing a set of objects that seemed to share a mathematical vocabulary. The investigators had a word for the whole configuration. They said Cydonia read like a site, not a mountain range, a plan. And the mainstream had a word for it too, pareidolia, extended from shapes to patterns. The human brain, they argued, is a pattern-finding machine that will connect dots into constellations that were never drawn. Both explanations were on the table, but only one of them was going to survive contact with a better camera. And a better camera was coming. For over 20 years, everything anyone knew about Cydonia came from the Viking images of 1976. And those images were coarse. The best of them resolved the ground at around 50 meters per pixel, meaning the smallest thing the camera could see was the size of a large building. At that resolution, a face is a suggestion. A pyramid is an outline. You are reading the shape of the land through a screen door. Everyone knew that the only way to settle the argument was to go back with something sharper. Then, in 1996, NASA launched a spacecraft built to do exactly that. It was called Mars Global Surveyor, and it carried a camera that could resolve features down to the size of a coffee table, more than 10 times finer than Viking. For the first time, the objects of Cydonia were going to be seen clearly, and the whole world was waiting to find out what the face really was. Here is where it gets strange, and here is where the story stops being about rocks and starts being about who controls the pictures. On April the 6th, 1998, Mars Global Surveyor turned its camera on the face and took the sharpest image ever captured of it. NASA processed it and released it to the public. And the image that came out was almost unreadable. It was stretched, low in contrast, washed of detail, shot at an extreme oblique angle that flattened everything, and run through filters that stripped the data down. The New York Times looked at it and said it resembled a sandal print or a stuffed chili pepper. The face was gone. Case closed, the headlines said. Just a rock after all. Except the researchers who had spent 15 years measuring Cydonia looked at that release and did not see a fair photograph. They saw a burial. They started calling it the cat box, a mocking name for what they considered a deliberately degraded image. One independent engineer and NASA subcontractor, Lan Fleming, ran his own analysis of the released picture and wrote a report accusing the processing of flattening and distorting the very feature it claimed to be revealing. Certain elements, visible in the frame, including an oval crater beside the face, were cropped out of the versions that reached the press. The argument was not that the face was definitely artificial. The argument was that the public was handed the least convincing possible version of the most important photograph in the story, and told the matter was settled. Whether that was ordinary image processing or something less innocent, the pattern is the same one that runs through every buried mystery. The thing everyone wanted to see clearly was shown to them blurred, and then the door was closed. And that brings us to the third clue, the one that is the hardest to talk about honestly, because this is where the sharper cameras cut in both directions. In 2001, Mars Global Surveyor got a second chance. On April the 8th, the spacecraft flew over Cydonia again, this time in near-vertical, high-quality light, and took an image of the face at roughly 1.5 meters per pixel. This was the real thing. No extreme angle, no cat box. The clearest look humanity had ever had. And in that image, the face largely dissolved. The eyes that had seemed so sharp under Viking's low sun became ordinary rises in the ground. The mouth became a natural depression. Seen from straight above in good light, the 2-kilometer mesa looked like what the mainstream had always said it was, a heavily eroded hill. Later images from other spacecraft, including a 3-dimensional reconstruction built from European data in 2006, told the same story from every angle. As a face, it fell apart. There was one more instrument brought to bear, and it is worth mentioning because it was supposed to be the tiebreaker. In 2001, NASA's Mars Odyssey orbiter carried a thermal imaging system that could read the surface not by light, but by heat, day, or night. The theory was elegant. A solid natural mountain and a hollow artificial structure would hold and release heat differently, so an infrared scan might see straight through the argument about shadows. Odyssey took its infrared look at the face, and the result disappointed almost everyone. The resolution was not sharp enough to reveal a hidden interior, and the heat signature was read by the mainstream as consistent with ordinary rock. It neither confirmed nor destroyed anything. The one tool that might have looked inside came back inconclusive, and the spotlight moved on again. And here is the honest thing that a lot of channels will not tell you. The sharper the picture got, the more the face looked natural. That is a fact, and pretending otherwise is an insult. But notice what the good cameras did and did not resolve. They resolved the face. They demonstrated, fairly, that the resemblance to a human head was a product of low resolution and dramatic shadow. What they did not do was make the 500 and 1000 pyramids' five-fold symmetry vanish, or explain away the angle ratios Torun measured, or account for why a symmetrical pyramid sits with its axis pointed at a specific hill. Those questions were never resolved by a photograph. They were left behind as the spotlight moved on. The face got debunked. The geometry got forgotten. And forgetting is not the same as answering. Now, here is the part where I owe you honesty, because the truth deserves better than hype. Does any of this prove that an ancient civilization built monuments on Mars, that the 500 and 1000 pyramid is a machine, or a temple, or a message left for us to find? No, it does not, and I am not going to pretend it does. The skeptical case is strong, and it rests mostly on one man's careful work. An astronomer and educator named Stuart Robbins went back to the 500 and 1000 pyramid using modern, high-resolution data, far better than anything Torun and Hoagland had, and remeasured the angles himself. His finding was blunt. On a 5-sided shape, there are far more than the 9 angles the original investigators chose to report. By his count, there are dozens of possible angles you could measure. Choosing only 9, the ones that happen to yield the interesting numbers, is exactly the trap that fools people. When he measured across the full set on sharper data, the pyramid's corners shifted by a couple of degrees, depending on where he placed them, because the object is not a crisp geometric solid. It is a rough mound, and that wobble on modern data was still within the size of a single pixel of the old Viking images the original claims were built on. In other words, the precision Torun and Hoagland claimed was finer than their data could physically support. On top of that, the exact Martian latitude of the pyramid has been revised by newer spacecraft, which quietly removes the tidy E over pi coincidence. Measure enough angles on a lumpy rock, the skeptics say, and pi and E will always show up eventually. It is not a message, it is mathematics being generous. Concede all of that. It is fair, and it is probably right about the face. But strip away every wild theory, and the plain facts that remain are still stranger than the fantasy. There is a 5-sided, roughly symmetrical mountain, nearly 2 miles long, sitting on the surface of another planet. It was measured by a professional cartographer from a government mapping agency who could not name a natural process that would produce it. It sits in a field of mesas that some of the sharpest imaging we have has still not fully explained. And the clearest picture of the region's most famous object was first handed to the public in a form so degraded that people inside the program itself called it a cover-up. You do not need Martians to be unsettled by that. You just need to look at what is actually there in the archive with a catalog number photographed by real spacecraft and admit that the tidy answer skips over the parts that do not fit. And if even the modest version of this is true, it means something uncomfortable about how we decide what is settled. It means that a symmetrical, mathematically strange landform on another world was measured, argued about, quietly reclassified as erosion, and then dropped, not because every question was answered, but because the most photogenic one, the face, turned out to be a hill. It means the story of Cydonia was closed on the strength of the object that was easiest to explain, while the object that was hardest to explain was left standing in the dust with its 5 sides pointed at the sky. Our picture of Mars is not a finished portrait. It is a sketch with pieces missing. And if we can miss the meaning of a mountain this large on the most photographed patch of ground on the entire red planet, then what are we missing on the ground we have barely looked at? Think about what is coming next. There are landers and orbiters at Mars right now with instruments that dwarf anything Viking carried, and every year the resolution climbs. Sooner or later, human beings are going to stand in Cydonia. They are going to walk up to the base of that 5-sided mountain and put their hands on it and know, finally, whether the angles were a message or an accident. Until then, the 501,000th pyramid is exactly what it has always been. A shape that should not be that regular, in a place that should not be that organized, measured by people who could not explain it, and waved off by people who did not want to. Here is the question that will not let go. If the resemblance of the face was only ever a trick of light, then why does the pyramid beside it still hold its symmetry in the sharpest photographs we own? A shadow moves when the sun moves. That mountain does not. It has kept its 5 sides through every sunrise for longer than there has been a human eye to see it, pointing at a face that time turned back into a hill, keeping whatever secret a shape can keep. So who really found the strangest structure on Mars? Not a treasure hunter. Not a fantasist. A spacecraft looking for a place to land, a pair of NASA engineers digging through a misfiled archive, and a government cartographer who set out to prove it was natural and could not. They found a face that faded, and behind it, a pyramid that did not. The pyramid is still there. It is still 5-sided. It is still aimed at the sky, and no one who has ever measured it has been able to tell you, with certainty, what carved it. The red planet is turning in the dark, exactly as it has for 4.5 billion years. And on its surface, in a region called Cydonia, an object the length of a city sits waiting in the dust for the first human hand to reach it and settle the argument for good. It was found, it was measured, and then it was quietly left alone. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you up at night, watch the next investigation playing on screen right now, because the discovery in that one connects to this in a way you will not see coming.